So yes, here we are, YouTubers, and I want to give a concise talk about the Second World War and how it's affecting us now and the legacy of it thereof. So basically, I suppose my main contention is this idea that the Allies, the British and the Americans, are the victors and somehow holders of this moral truth somehow, and I do want to dispute that, but cautionarily, because I do know that so many people gave up their lives and endured so much suffering to fight against Nazi Germany at that time. So I know, well, I don't know, but I know secondhand, I suppose, from speaking to many people of the type of endurance and struggles that they endured and many hardships that there were in that time. Nevertheless, the idea of anything being beyond criticism is wrong, of course. And I know that Nazi Germany, of course, itself was particularly horrific in the manner in which it actually discriminated against so many different types of people, but in a particular way, like in a gradual development where it did it to divide and rule different people over a long period of time. Especially the pre-war years in Nazi Germany that were particularly horrific. You know, how mentally ill people, for example, were treated, you know, many of whom killed off by euthanasia or were prevented from breeding, you know, because they bought in their government to this Darwinian idealism that it was survival of the fittest and the strongest, and that, of course, quite contrary to real human experience, because we're all vulnerable sometimes. We all begin as children. You know, how vulnerable and inexperienced are we at that point? And we all are to begin with. So that whole ideology needed to be confronted and still needs to be today, actually. It's still something that is a malignant cause of terrible division within our society. It's something that still affects us now, actually. The neo-Nazi movement, sadly, still continues to this day, and our resistance to it still must as well. But I think our analysis of the British, American and the Allied forces' involvement in that war is something that needs to be critically looked upon, because we tend to look back in Remembrance Day and other events like that tend to memorialise and heroise, idolise people that were involved in that conflict. You know, and I can understand that when you've lost members of your family, when you've become orphaned or widowed, and that's much more the very elderly today, or, you know, the generation after that. You know, there are a lot of people today that have lost a parent that aren't so old, and so, you know, it's still something of deep meaning to those people as well. And so I am quite aware that being critical of British policy and their war effort during those times is something that will affect people. But I strive nevertheless to be objective in the truth as much as I can, and not to be persuaded by patriotic or other kinds of persuasiveness. But because what I do know is that the British did a lot of good things in fighting against Nazi Germany at that time, actually. And the Americans, of course, came in to help, sure. The Allied forces, as they're called in general. Nevertheless, I don't think it is wrong to be critical of some of the practices that happened in that war, actually. And that's not to be critical of all of the people that existed and that endured and that continued throughout that phase. But actually, if I'm honest, having looked at some of the historical evidences, and you can only try to be honest, right, that I actually do think that the British armed forces were wrong in some of their behaviours and practices. And actually, if you look at in Germany, for example, there were occasions of carpet bombing whole cities that were destroyed, and that involved, therefore, civilian casualties, the deaths and injuries of young children, of the elderly, of women, some of whom were pregnant, but actually, not to play on the heartstrings, just of ordinary citizens like me, just of people, you know, who were nothing to do with the warfare. But actually, I think there have to be regulations in warfare, you know, and I think it's wrong to have those procedures where you just carpet bomb and destroy whole cities or regions of cities, actually. And the majority of deaths during that Second World War were civilians, actually. The British experienced it themselves, actually, during the Blitz. Many civilians died within that in many different cities, whether it was Coventry or London. Bristol, in fact, had its own victims. But that happened in Germany too, where many civilians died as a result of British bombing campaigns, or Russian, some of them were. Just horrific. And so when I look back at the role of the British forces within that war, and I think, yes, there may have been some good within it, but there was a lot of bad as well that happened then, actually, to be honest. And, you know, I don't say that as a criticism of people that are still alive and they're very elderly and vulnerable, and also as a larger group, their children who are probably elderly themselves, I imagine, though. But I do think that, yes, you can't make exceptions. There have to be these regulations in war. If other people are behaving abhorrent and destructive, and there's no doubt Nazi Germany was horrific in its type of violence towards its own populace, and it was spreading, right? So it needed to be stopped. But there could perhaps have been other avenues, other ways of treating that, like economic sanctions, you know, like that are being done today against Venezuela, Iran, and Nicaragua, and the like, China, perhaps. But, you know, there could have been other military forms of intervention as well that didn't involve such a catastrophic loss of civilian lives, many of whom were nothing to do with the Nazi Party and just happened to be living within that country, unfortunately. And so you know, it's easy to say, it's easy to sort of give an unqualified answer of like giving total support to the British forces and saying there were total heroes within that war, and there wasn't some badness, there wasn't some mistakes, and there were many actually, if you look at it honestly. But it's just as easy and tempting to go to the other extreme and say they were all wrong and they were all evil and they was all terrible. But actually, the answer, more often than not, somewhere in the middle, right? And I do think, yes, I can totally understand the British population, right, were quite afraid of the threat of Nazi Germany and its spread, and also quite concerned for the citizens within them. But you know, when you think about it, it's like, I'm concerned about the citizens within that country, but I end up bombing the citizens of that country. That is a contradiction, isn't it? And so that kind of policy of carpet bombing, you know, that is just totally wrong, isn't it? Whoever dreamt up that is like a total nihilist and just like totally wrong, basically, weren't they? And I think it's good in a sense that the Nazi regime came to an end. However, the way in which it was done, totally wrong. You look at Nagasaki and Hiroshima, you think the same things as well, like totally unnecessary and uncalled for. Now, there will be a lot of military pundits that disagree with that analysis and say the Japanese needed to be shown a warning and told that it was wrong and all this. But actually, they were already losing the war at that point, and actually, it just seemed totally wrong to kill innocent civilians, including so many little children. What kind of sacrifice is that worth making? Do you know what I mean? So I think it's okay to evaluate the war in those terms, right? It doesn't make you unpatriotic. It doesn't. Imposing moral views on things is a necessary thing in any conflict, regardless of what nationality, race, religion, or social, economic, or philosophical beliefs you might have, right? Because if you don't have some sort of moral belief, and that involves respecting the rights of civilians that are no threat to yourself, right? Then what do you stand for? You know, then you become the very thing you say you're fighting against, right? Then what are we for? So I look back at that Second World War with very mixed views, actually, to be honest with you. Whatever the Remembrance Day, you know, things say that I should think, or I've got my own views and I have to adhere to my own moral values of whatever conflict, you know, whether that's the Second, First, Third, or Second or Fifth World War. It doesn't matter what the conflict is, really. There still have to be, for me at least, some moral values within that, right? Nevertheless, can I sit in judgment over people that flew planes and dropped bombs and may have killed lots of people? No, because I wasn't in their position. I don't know what they were going through and what influenced them to do that, and what was in their belief, what was their moral intent at that time. They may well have believed they were doing the right thing at that time, even if it caused catastrophic destruction at the time. They may have thought, this is a good thing to do, I've been given orders and I've got to do it. But nevertheless, still, unless I know their position well, I can't really know what's in their heads or whether it's right or wrong for them. The amount of harm that something causes someone, right, isn't always necessarily a good guide to whether something is right or wrong. Someone can cause a huge amount of harm and still have good intentions. Conversely, someone can have very bad intentions but cause no harm at all, right? And that does happen. There have to be regulations in all things in life, in love and war, whatever the situation or circumstances. Always there have to be some kind of regulation. I look at it like, treat other people the way you want to be treated, and some people don't like that, but I suppose it depends how you want to be treated, right? I like being treated firm but fair, personally. I hate being treated firm, but I understand the need for it as well sometimes. But I like to be treated fair. So I like to treat other people that way. I don't know. It's a very interesting subject, warfare, actually, and what are the moral issues within it. And because people often go into opposing camps, and I so often find that the middle ground is vacant. Too often. That I often find some people that are so for a war, they'll turn a blind eye to anything, and that's, anything that their side do, at least, that's okay. And like the mistreatment of prisoners or civilians, serious issues, you think that should be discussed. But then you get people in the opposite camp, the people that are so anti-war, so-called pacifists, and they say everything is wrong, and that there's never a time to mistreat someone. There is never a time to harm anybody ever, and that's equally extreme, isn't it, really? That all people that do wrong to anyone, anytime, are all equally wrong somehow. I'm not saying they're all like that, but you get some people, don't you, some of the time that are. But what you don't find that much, I don't find anyway, is that many people with a middle ground where they try to look at both sides and try to assess, the wrongs and the rights of both sides of a warfare, and how important is that to actually try to employ the same moral standards and scrutiny to different sides of a conflict, whether they are Germans bombing British civilians or British servicemen who are bombing and killing German civilians, or whether it's in the Iraq War, right, the American Civil War, or Afghanistan War, or whatever the other conflicts are, right? That is the important thing to me, that we remain objective in trying to employ the same moral standards and not be persuaded by emotionally manipulative rhetoric that persuades us to judge one side with a different set of standards than different people.